With the surprise late 2022 release on the Nintendo Switch eShop, Mortal Shell Complete Edition gives Switch users the complete package, a complete port now in handheld form. All DLC and content updates are included, and at first glance, Mortal Shell on Switch actually looks like a success. In much the same vein as, say, other Unreal Engine 4 titles like Mortal Kombat 11, the visual makeup, the core details of the action, translate pretty well to Switch. It's a truly scalable engine, but having spent the last week playing Mortal Shell on Switch, I've got to say it, hitting such an ambitious bar of quality, visually speaking, comes at a cost to its frame rate. Its overall playability. To such an extent, actually, I found this Switch release is at times a genuine struggle to control. So just how does Switch compare in its graphics settings to a dedicated console version like the base PS4? And what's the state of its frame rate performance? Let's find out. To cut to the chase, even compared to the PS4 release from 2020, Mortal Shell on Switch is an obvious downgrade in key areas. It's interesting to note, Switch actually appears to use a newer dated build of the game as a foundation, judging by its menus. Combined with the fact comparisons aren't always strictly in PS4's favour, it does suggest the feature set on Switch might be a little more recent, like in how the lighting works, as you might notice in some shots, even if most settings are dialed back. More on that in a second. To start at the top though, you'll notice texture assets are dropped in resolution across Fulgrim. Notably, the floors, the walls of dungeons, often manifest as this blurry smudge if viewed too close. The best theory is Switch's 4GB of RAM is really the limiting factor here, though certain points still get priority for high quality textures. So for example, character texture work is identical to PS4's, armor sets, the so-called shells, are crisply defined in close-up, as is the weaponry. Impressively, even cloth physics stay enabled on Switch as we walk the world, with cloaks, draping flags, and more billowing dynamically. But yes, the environmental detail does take a serious cutback in select spots. For the Switch release, these lower grade assets would explain its smaller 5GB install compared to the 7GB on PS4. Not that it makes a huge saving, particularly for Switch's storage really. At a distance, especially played handheld on Switch, the texture quality drop also doesn't always stick out, but if you look close, the cavern walls, even the stairs in this dungeon route, are more than a little glaring. At points, the materials even look more like they're struggling from a texture streaming bug, as opposed to a specific low setting. Another striking difference is around this external narthex area, a segment of Fulgrim built on these looming monolithic structures. Here, the PS4 release uses detailed geometry to chisel out patterns across the ground, though that's all stripped back on Switch. Again, it appears polygon counts are dropped, a concession to play to the handheld's more limited Tegra X1 GPU. A few other downgrades stick out on Switch as well. You might have noticed already the dropped grass foliage density just as we walk through the opening marshland area, and equally, draw distance on trees is subtly pruned back as well to the back of this shot. The more striking downgrade though, well, that'll be the water. See those water ripple physics on PS4? That's all completely gone on Switch, completely absent. The only thing left behind being the transparency effects for caustics and splashes as we walk through. Added to that, screen space reflections are dropped in accuracy on Switch too, meaning fewer on-screen elements factor into the final mirror image. In fairness though, SSR is definitely engaged, and all things considered, it's impressive it makes the cut at all. A few last points before we jump to the performance tests, because for all the cutbacks, Switch does a remarkable job in retaining a lot of the detail, effects, and features of the PS4 release. Motion blur effects are included in the menus, we have mist, fog, and other atmospheric effects rolling across the distance, ambient occlusion is enabled too, impressively, adding shading to its world. It's also got to be said, pop-in is surprisingly minimal as we run through detail-dense areas, though partly the contained level design helps there. So yes, the drawbacks are pretty easy to pick out. I mean, Switch is missing the depth of field effect on PS4, and the volumetric lighting is reduced in resolution too, creating these obvious stair steps to light shafts. Likewise, dynamic shadows, while near torchlight, appears to be missing on Switch, but in broad strokes, Switch has all the content, the framework of the world design that makes Mortal Shell enjoyable. Now, as I've mentioned, Switch has one curious advantage over PS4 in lighting. Note how during this boss fight, the flame effect produces lighting across his body, which is missing on PS4. Again, perhaps it's a byproduct of Switch using a more recent build, but there's no doubt a bonus here for the Nintendo release right now. Next up, the frame rate and resolution stats. Now, for perspective, the base PS4 release is worth looking at first, just quickly, to understand the challenge ahead for Switch. All my testing here uses new capture based on the very latest build, and frankly, PS4 still holds together a 30 frames per second experience pretty well. A majority of the time anyway. It still runs at a dynamic 1600 by 900 resolution, with temporal anti-aliasing reconstructing to a 1080p image, but typically 900p is the actual native resolution on PS4. Also, as a rule of thumb, PS4 sticks to its 30fps cap around Fulgrim, the Narthex area, and even dungeons clogged with enemies. But yes, it's also impossible to ignore three issues with this release. Firstly, there's aggressive screen tearing. Not just at the top third of the frame, but also the lower third, where the tailline kind of alternates between the two spots on your display. It's more than a little distracting, especially in areas like this encampment, where it's constantly slicing each frame in two. The second point on PS4, it's the uneven frame pacing on the 30fps cap. Notice how the frame time graph here jumps up to 16 milliseconds at points, giving 2 unique frames in a row, and then right after that it trolls back down to closer to 50 milliseconds. It's an issue with PS4's approach to capping at 30fps, where there should in theory just be a long stretch at 33 milliseconds, unwavering and stable. So despite an average 30fps, absolutely it might not feel like it owing to the way the 30fps cap is implemented. Which leads to point number 3. There are huge streaming hitches on PS4 which plummet the frame rate and indeed the frame time right down. Just walking through dungeons, the engine's clearly streaming enemies, geometry and more around the bend here, triggering a sequence of huge frame time spikes. It again makes PS4 less enjoyable to play than it should be, less stable overall, and all of this on a dedicated console with specs that outweigh the Nintendo Switch. Enter the Switch release of Mortal Shell. The question going into this really is, are all the visual cutbacks enough to sidestep PS4's issues, to alleviate the demands on a much more GPU and CPU constrained portable system? Is the drop in texture quality enough? The lower grade geometry, foliage, dynamic shadows, water physics, and volumetric effects. And in fact, the reduced native resolution on Switch too. So on that note, let's start with the resolutions. While docked, Switch reconstructs to 720p, though the typical native resolution is between 540p and 600p to my count, typically resting at that 1066 by 600 mark. I'll get to Switch's portable mode shortly, but as far as the docked play goes, the Unreal Engine TAA does a surprisingly great job at reconstructing the image. Certainly, it's less clean and clear when showing it right after PS4, and any heavy action or quick camera pans reveal Switch's much lower native pixel structure. It's not always pretty, but overall, it's about what we'd expect of a taxing, heavily detailed Unreal Engine title on Nintendo's handheld. The frame rate side is less of a success. To be blunt, the range of performance on Switch suffers from being entirely unlocked. In other words, no 30fps cap here, letting it run between 10 frames per second at its very worst point, and as high as almost 60fps look into the sky. For most areas though, well, you're typically at between 15 to 40fps realistically. So the marshland areas in Fulgrim to start usually play out in this range, wavering up and down the graph. All round, it makes inputs for simple navigation or weapon strikes less responsive, less dependable than they need to be. And the further into the Fulgrim marshes you go, the worse it sadly seems to become. In fact, there are entire points across one later dungeon which flow at a near constant 15 to 20 FPS, where putting too many enemies on the screen seems to be the culprit. Again, the challenge for Switch is huge here, but in combat, even with all the visual cutbacks, the low frame rate has a genuine impact on the playability of the game. Any enemies in groups with terraforming attacks or heavy transparency effects pushes the Tegra X1 much too hard. Case in point, this boss battle has us go down to the 10 FPS line at points, which again makes controlling the game a massive struggle. At the moment you most need to time a critical dodge, the visual feedback on Switch here just isn't stable enough to work with. So all of this leaves us with one of the more extreme performance lows we've seen in recent memory on the console. And worse still, on top of the low frame rate, there are these frame time hitches too. We get frame time spikes down to 150 milliseconds on Switch, just simply landing your first hit on an enemy, and even, oddly enough, simple actions like picking up items triggers a momentary hitch. All combined, it never feels particularly enjoyable playing docked on a big screen. So yes, while Switch's performance is far from ideal, it's interesting to note some areas do go beyond 30 FPS. It rarely capitalizes on it, obviously, and honestly a stable 30 FPS cap would be better. Still, we see certain areas, like this opening ruin, run at almost 35 FPS, and looking directly upwards, if you're so inclined, gets you in touching distance of 60 FPS. Practically speaking, this is hardly useful for any proper gameplay, but I will say if Mortal Shell keeps its frame rate unlocked on Switch, and supposing a Switch successor with back compat appears, Mortal Shell could be the perfect benchmark material for testing new hardware. A lot of ifs there, I realise, but still there's huge performance headroom to tap into, which the current Switch just struggles to do. Also, and clearly, for all its issues in performance, there's an advantage on the Switch release compared to PS4 in the lack of screen tearing. It's fully V-synced play with no tearing artifacts up and down the screen, so while the frame rate is evidently much lower on average on Switch, at least there's no tearing. How about portable play then? Sadly, there's not much improvement here in frame rate. We're still in a similar 15 to 40 FPS range of performance, usually centering on the mid-20s and under during combat, so no real gain there. As for the pixel counts, running in handheld mode forces Switch's GPU clock to drop, and so the native resolution adjusts accordingly. We get a range of 360p and 400p looking at the raw pixel structures, but again, all of this reconstructs via TAA to 720p. All Switch's other visual settings appear identical to the docked experience otherwise, it's just the resolution range that changes. And as ever, the frame rate drops are mitigated, just by a bit, by running on the smaller display. It's less noticeable, but when we hit the 10 FPS line for example, or bump into a frame time hitch, it's clear performance is still a pretty big issue. One final point on loading times. This is a big one for any Souls-like where dying and respawning are key parts of the gameplay loop, and I'm glad to say Switch is not only competitive with PS4, but actually faster in some cases for getting back to the action. The one big caveat is Switch must go through a lengthy initial load to boot the game itself, so here's that test. PS4 versus Switch, selecting the game from the menus on each, you get 6 unskippable logos at the start, and eventually we get to the main menu after a 1 minute 40-second wait. The good news is Switch's suspend and resume feature bypasses all of this anyway, and the even better news, after that initial load, Switch improves on PS4's loading times by a few seconds. It's not snappy by any means, but usually you're expecting a wait of 21 seconds on Switch after dying and waiting to respawn, up against around 28 seconds on PS4. Sometimes it's faster on both, but the trend across a bulk of tests is there's a Switch plus point here. Overall then, the verdict for Mortal Shell on Switch is pretty mixed. It's an ambitious port, clearly, and once again we're faced with software that's dying for a Switch successor to run it well. And it'll be a great title to test, in theory, if and when one appears. As it is though, the visual cutbacks are expected next to PS4, low quality textures, geometry, and effects are enforced, but Mortal Shell's world still looks largely intact on Switch. The resulting frame rate on Switch though is just not where it needs to be. I mean, to start, an evenly frame-paced 30 FPS cap might help some points, but with so much play languishing under 30 and even 20 FPS, the benefits there will be limited. So, if you're looking for a taxing Switch port, a title that goes beyond its means with the GPU power on tap, Mortal Shell is a fascinating game to try, as an experiment. But honestly, to play and crucially enjoy the experience developer Cold Symmetry has created, there are far better versions out there. But that's all from me today. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter as usual. But from me for now, thanks for watching.